Okay, good morning. I'm now going to read what I said in chapter 6 of Gender and Development in Nigeria, chapter 6. This is the 11th part, and this part focuses on answering the question: how does structural violence manifest in Nigeria's political landscape? And what are its consequences for women's political participation? So I'm going to look at the manifestations and consequences of structural violence in Nigeria's political landscape. I provide what I believe is a rich and nuanced exploration in this chapter of how structural violence manifests within Nigeria's political landscape and the profound consequences it has for women's political participation. I argue that structural violence, a system of embedded inequalities that produces avoidable harm, operates through various interconnected mechanisms to systematically disadvantage women, limiting their access to power, silencing their voices, and undermining their ability to shape political decisions that impact their lives. And I basically identify 5 manifestations and consequences of structural violence. The first manifestation is electoral violence being used as a tool of intimidation. I underscore how violence against women in elections is a pervasive manifestation of structural violence in Nigeria's political system. This violence, ranging from verbal harassment and intimidation to physical assaults and even killings, creates a climate of fear that effectively discourages women from emerging in politics, both as candidates and as voters. It also affects electoral workers. I highlighted in the chapter how the state's failure to provide equitable security for all citizens places a disproportionate burden on women. This vulnerability is further magnified during elections, and women during elections are often targeted because they are perceived as easier to intimidate, less likely to retaliate, and more likely to conform to patriarchal expectations that discourage their participation in public life. The second manifestation that I discuss are in the form of discriminatory laws and practices that limit women's legal capacity. I illustrate how structural violence is embedded within the legal and administrative frameworks of the Nigerian state, creating a system of unequal protection that limits women's full participation in politics. These discriminatory laws and practices, often rooted in customary traditions and patriarchal interpretations of religious doctrines limit women's ability to do at least three things. The first is they can't inherit and own property. And this denies them economic resources that could facilitate their political ambitions. Second of the discriminatory laws and practices is that women are prevented from independently entering contracts, which hinders their ability to engage in business activities that could provide financial independence and social influence. The third of the discriminatory laws and practices that I mentioned in the chapter is that women are prevented from gaining full legal capacity, rendering them dependent on men for legal representation and decision-making, and further diminishing their autonomy and agency. So, a third set of manifestation and consequences of structural violence is the unequal access to resources and networks between men and women. So I emphasize here how structural violence is fueled by poverty and cultural norms that discourage women's education and economic empowerment. And these constraints also create significant barriers for women seeking to enter politics. And this unequal access to resources, networks, and mentorship opportunities places women at a stark disadvantage compared to their male counterparts, who often benefit from established patriarchal structures that provide them with three things. One of the things the patriarchal structures provide men is the financial resources to fund campaigns and build political machines. A second thing that the patriarchal structures offer to men is access to influential networks that provide connections and endorsements. A third thing that the patriarchal structures provide men with is mentorship from established male politicians that offer them guidance and support. So now, the fourth manifestation of structural violence and the way in which it affects Nigeria's political landscape is internalized patriarchal norms. I argue that patriarchal norms, which are deeply embedded in Nigerian culture, are often internalized by men and women. This creates a formidable obstacle to women's political advancement. This internalization manifests in at least three ways. Women, in the first place, may doubt their own capabilities and hesitate to step into leadership roles. A second way in which patriarchal norms are internalized is that communities may resist supporting female candidates, and they view politics as a male domain. A third way in which patriarchal norms are internalized is that female politicians may face pressure to conform to traditional expectations of femininity. And this limits their ability to challenge the status quo and advocate for change. Now, a fifth manifestation and the consequences that flow from it of structural violence in Nigeria's political landscape is the tokenistic representation of women and the failure of state action to really truly support women. Um, I critique the Nigerian government's approach to addressing gender inequality in politics. And I argue that it often amounts to tokenistic gestures rather than the meaningful policy implementation that is needed. I note how the emphasis on appointing a small number of women to high visibility positions, while failing to address the underlying structural barriers that hinder women's broader participation, ultimately serves to legitimize the existing patriarchal system and undermine efforts to achieve genuine gender equality. I specifically cite the decline in the percentage of women in elected positions, and I give the statistics in the chapter. Despite Nigeria's aspiration to achieve a 35% benchmark in all elected and appointive positions, as stated in the National Gender Policy, Nigeria is falling woefully behind other African countries. This is evidence of the state's lack of genuine commitment to addressing the root causes of gender inequality. So, essentially, what I'm saying in this part is that we need to soberly assess the ways in which structural violence permeates Nigeria's political landscape. And this creates a hostile environment for women who are seeking to exercise their political rights and participate in decision-making processes. The consequences of this structural violence are far-reaching, not only for women's individual opportunities and well-being, but also for the health and vitality of Nigeria's democracy. Addressing these deeply entrenched systems of disadvantage requires a comprehensive and sustained effort that challenges patriarchal norms and strengthens legal protections, and also expand access to education and economic resources to ensure the safety and security of women and promote their meaningful inclusion in political decision-making processes. So if these things are addressed, that is what would foster increased women's political participation. Thank you.